This presentation will cover whether or not the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Lives Matter movement are comparable and what are some similarities and differences. The Civil Rights Movement and the Black Lives Matter movement are comparable because they tackle the same issue, which is the mistreatment of African American people. This mistreatment of African Americans date back to the time of slavery, and the mentality to keep African Americans inferior has been evident within the Supreme Court rulings. One specific case is the Dred Scott ruling that ruled that slaves were property and not citizens. This mentality that African Americans are inferior or that they're just mistreated wrong has been transformed throughout the years. One transformation of the same mentality, just shown in a progressive way as laws have improved, is with segregation. Even though African Americans aren't slaves anymore, they're still mistreated, and are looked at as inferior. This mentality can be shown with the ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson, which upheld the ruling that separate but equal is constitutional. The progression has led to when segregation has been abolished, and this transformation of keeping blacks inferior have been with the war on drugs and the heavy policing, which has contributed to the mass incarceration rate. Now, this led to African Americans being viewed as inferior or becoming inferior is because it broke up families, and it really took a toll on a lot of people's lives. Even though these movements share the similar backings and where they came from are from the same part, there's a difference in effectiveness. One of the reasons that the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Lives Matter movement differ is that the Civil Rights Movement had better centralized goals. So the Civil Rights Movement targeted specific laws through civil disobedience. So a specific law that they targeted was the segregation on the bus, and they targeted it with the Montgomery bus boycott, which Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. Another movement that they targeted, or law that they targeted, was the lunch counter sit-ins, which kept the restaurants segregated, and they targeted by having African Americans sit at the counter until they were being served. This was successful, as restaurants were losing money, as African Americans were taking up seats but not buying anything because they wouldn't allow it. So because the Civil Rights Movement targeted specific goals or specific laws, they were able to become more effective. Now, the Black Lives Matter movement is targeting police brutality and racial profiling, which does not have any specific laws that are attached to them, which makes it harder for protesters to actually protest and be proactive towards it. So the Black Lives Matter movement is more reactive than proactive, which leads to ineffectiveness. Another key difference between the Black Lives Matter movement and the Civil Rights Movement is that there is a different source and style of leadership. So the Civil Rights Movement was led by primarily Martin Luther King Jr., who was a reverend of a Southern Baptist church. The influence of the religious ideals are heavily implemented in this movement. The spreading of the Civil Rights Movement was also seen through church leaders as they met up to gain popularity. And the Civil Rights Movement took a nonviolent national approach as MLK led them. The difference between that and the Black Lives Matter movement is the Black Lives Matter movement had no centralized national leaders. The movement spreads through social media, and protests are localized, which, through a lack of leadership, leads the movement astray, and the movement has transferred into a negative light with extreme protesters who loot and destruct the cities they protest in. So overall, the Black Lives Matter movement and the Civil Rights Movement are definitely comparable, as they both target the same issues that have been around society since the beginning. Even though they share similar issues, there's key differences that show in the effectiveness. And in order for there to be increase in effectiveness in the Black Lives Matter movement, there needs to be centralized leaders and national versus localized, and then there needs to be also more structure in the movement.